Hello and welcome to AXSChat. And today we're going to have a topic that's been put forward by Debra, which is talking about the idea of partial inclusion. Now, I'm going to hand straight over to Debra, who I think you know, so needs no introduction. And Debra, tell us, what do you mean by this?
Well, and I also want to say that we're also playing around with, we always want to update what we're doing at AXSChat. I believe we're on our 10th year. So I'm hoping that we do more of these conversations where it's just the three of us because, we're all leaders in our own right. And I think that sometimes it's really interesting just, hearing from the three of us. So I'm excited about the conversation. But I recently wrote a blog on LinkedIn and it was called Partial Inclusion. And the reason why I wrote it was because I keep hearing people say the same thing that, by the way, I'm also guilty of saying many, 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 many times, but I just stopped saying it after a while when I started realizing the errors of what I was saying. And so what I'm talking about, I was talking to somebody the other day and they said, Debra, I don't know why these corporate brands don't understand that if you do not include people with disabilities, you're leaving tons of money on the table. You're just leaving it wasted. These people are just not being included at all. And you're just losing trillions of dollars. It's ridiculous. Why don't you care about the money to include us? Well, the reality is that is not really true. What is happening is we are partially included. Because the reality is people with disabilities, yes, they're a billion strong, but the reality is we still do have to bank and we want to go to school. We still have to, work in the office and we want to go to the libraries and we want to go out to eat and we want to be part of society, but society makes it so much harder for us to be part of this by making banks that are not really accessible to us. And so we actually have to do all these workarounds just to get basic services from the bank. And forget about upselling us, bank. We can barely do what we critically need to do because you've made it so hard for us humans, sometimes with disabilities, to use your services. So it is not total exclusion, it's partial inclusion, partial inclusion and partial exclusion. And the reality is this isn't not good for society or any of our business or brands either. And so I posted that just because I was curious if other people also felt this way. And it really got a lot of really powerful responses. And I think we need to talk about it more because the reality is partial inclusion, it also has the way it lays out, it is very different from you're fully excluded. Okay, fine. Well, you've been excluded forever. So we're going to give you this little tiny thing over here and you're supposed to be grateful. We want to be fully included. We want to be meaningfully included. And so I think that's why it's important to dig into these topics a little bit deeper now. So what do you think about that?
So,
go ahead.
So I have a question for you. How do you think that the current legislation that we have is actually helps us and entities not to fully include people with disabilities? Isn't sometimes legislation responsible for people only doing that partial part of inclusion?
Yeah, I agree. I think that we are, first of all, legislation's failing us because, for example, I love being American. But I really don't like the way we have defined disabilities in the United States. We have made it so broad, and I get it. People don't want to be disenfranchised and left out, but we've made it so broad. Even the UN CRPD, sometimes I wonder, the definitions are so broad that actually we wind up leaving so many more people out and not really being able to focus on the real problem. Because there are people with disabilities, certain types of disabilities, that are definitely left out in record numbers compared to other parts of the community that maybe we haven't been left out as much. Someone like me that's neurodiverse, I wasn't left out, but I wasn't as meaningfully included as I could have been to add more value. But it was because I was just too neurodiverse, too talkative, too this, too that. And I haven't been accommodated, but I didn't even realize I was part of the community to be accommodated, blah, blah, blah. But I still was included. There are people that were never included and are still not being included. And so I think the legislation not only gives people ways out, as you're saying, Antonio, and wiggle room, but it also doesn't even address the problem that we're actually trying to solve, which is true, meaningful inclusion.
I was talking with a person today on Instagram that is doing, she's going to moderate a debate, a panel in the Portuguese television about the European disability card. And then I engaging with her and telling, no, many of the people who represented Portuguese institutions in the EU accessible programs, or even this, they are there to represent organizations, and many don't identify themselves as having a disability. This has been very common in Portugal, where someone represents the people with disabilities,
Right.
and they are the ones attending all these meetings. And of course, the problem of this is part of the issue that also leads to partial inclusion, because people don't, sometimes you might be in the meeting where we might be talking or addressing issues with people with disabilities, and a large percentage of the people within the room don't have a disability, and they are the ones representing the communities.
Right. Or they do have a disability, but they don't want to admit
Yes,
it for a couple of reasons. Maybe because they think, oh, if I'm admitting it, it sounds like I'm just finding a reason to be included. And it's just a token disability, because we're also told that, well, your disability is valuable as my disability. I remember there have been times in my daughter's life, my daughter with Down syndrome, where she was too disabled or not disabled enough to make some cut. And I just remember thinking, this does not make sense to me. And so, yeah, I think that's also a huge part of the partial. And at some point, Antonio, Neil, we really do have to talk about what are the problems we're trying to solve, because it feels like as we've been throwing so much at it to solve all the problems, it's starting to feel like we're not even solving the right problems. And once again, I always say, I find it fascinating, and I'm one of them that have done this, that we demand the corporations. By the way, we demand the corporations solve our societal problems. We want you to solve them right now, and you want to start including us meaningfully, and you need to fix the technology, blah, blah. But the reality is, no, we've all let this happen. We've all let it happen. And some of it I let happen on my watch too, because you just feel that the problems are too big. You don't even know how to begin to solve them, right? But I think talking about what's really going on is a good way to start talking about this. We are partially excluded.
Yeah, that's why when we when you're talking about that, we don't know where to start. That's why I get really, really annoyed when the conversation starts with standards.
Oh, I agree. You're right.
Right. So I think this relates back to some of the conversations that I had ages ago with Kevin Carey, who used to be the chair of RNIB, and he talked about so you can have standards, and they think work for things like technology and interoperability and certain things, but they don't work for others, and they don't really give you a measure of what it is to be included. He said really it's what he called, and it's kind of an academic term, but peer normative equivalence of experience. So it's like, is the experience that I have of a product or service as good, as easy as someone else? And frankly, even the technically accessible products and services don't give you that same equivalence a lot of the time. So it's not equity, it's not equal in that way. And I think that means that even when organizations, like mine, work hard towards meeting our legal requirements and doing the compliance and making sure that we do the work to try and make everything work together, which in technology is actually pretty hard when you look at the complexity of large organizations. We still don't give that equivalence of experience a lot of the time, other than sometimes actually in enterprise everything's equally crappy, because it's enterprise tech is the experience of employees in the workplace and of technology is not as good as some of the consumer tech, frankly. So you can have an equally crappy experience. So you can, and I think that then actually, regardless of disability, it can come down to technological literacy or your propensity. You can be partially included. We partially include people in company life by putting stuff on channels, and this is not just my organization, but
that's everybody,
on channels that people don't see or don't interact with or don't use, right? That people are partially included. In theory, you can access it, but in reality, that's not necessarily the case. So I think there's very few cases where you have full inclusion, because society has so many differences. People do things in so many different ways that the way that people experience things is going to be different. Of course, when it comes to our core topic of including people with disabilities, then especially for essential services, then there has to be that effort made to make it as close to equivalent as possible, so that people can access those services. So for banking, for government, for all of these kind of things. And I think that efforts have been made in government. So some of our online services, and applying for a passport or a new driver's license in the UK, pretty easy these days online and pretty accessible. Would I say it's a joyous experience? No. But it's functional, and but I think there's so much else of our life that goes on where there is that partial inclusion that it is difficult to address. So how would you suggest we go about determining what level of inclusion or exclusion is permissible or acceptable? Because that's the reason we end up with standards, because we have to have some kind of benchmark that people can kind of agree on, and they're imperfect.
Right. And you know what? Before I go there, I just want to make another comment. You know what we also do to each other is that when we're partially included, we're making it harder for people to do the basic things they need to do. People have a tendency to think they're stupid. Something's wrong with them. And that happens a lot. And we do that. You see that we doing that to each other as we're aging as well. I'm a woman of a certain age now. And I noticed that we make our systems inaccessible to humans because we're being careless. We're not really designing in a way that is really inclusive to all humans. And so these partial inclusions happen, and then you call to get help and you're yelled at almost by that, or people are being impatient with you because you're so slow so people make it about themselves, that somehow they failed. And I see that a lot, and that's really impacting our mental health. And sadly, here in the United States, last year, 2023 was our highest number of suicides ever in record. And so I just want to say there are also human costs to these poor designs. There are human costs with people blaming themselves for being too stupid that they can't keep up with society. And I think that's a huge issue too. And then just going back to what you said is, should it always be about standards? We made it about standards. We made it about the laws, and we made it about standards. And here in the United States, we made it about lawyers. You better include us or I'm going to sue you. Well, we tried doing that. And actually, as a world, we progressed. We progressed in some ways. We progressed, but I think we progressed as far as we can with those outdated ways of thinking about these topics. Once again, what are we trying to solve here? I know that last week or the other week, we were talking to Mike Gifford, and he brought up a term I had not been familiar with, which is planet-centered design. And so I went out and started looking at it, and I loved what they're talking about, because it's not possible, I think, to know everything that's happening right now and how AI is joining these conversations meaningfully or not meaningfully, but still it's almost causing data to move faster than ever before. And so I think it's important to have these conversations to understand that the way we're doing it now, with only looking at legislation and standards, and or here in the States, lawyers, it's not meeting the needs of the people. It's just not meeting the needs of the problems we're trying to solve, the gaps we're trying to close, the divides we're trying to narrow. It's not working. And so I think we have to, and the one reason why I think it's important to talk about partial inclusion is because when we say to big corporations, I mean, you two represent a gigantic billion-dollar corporation. When we say to the leaders and the representative of these organizations, well, you're leaving out a billion people and you're losing money. You don't believe us because we can't ground it. It's like, what? Really? Are you sure? And so instead, I think we need to talk about what the real problems are when you do not make sure that your systems and your technology works for all of your customers, all of your potential customers. You make our lives harder. You make it harder for us to do business with you. You make it harder for us to buy from you. Maybe we do want all your new cool little upgrades and upsells. We can't even get basic services. That's a huge problem that I really think we need to rethink.
Yeah, and you know,
let's use the right language. Let's at least say what the problem is. This is the problem. We're partially included, partially excluded. Some of us are more included than others. Some of us are more privileged, and so we get better inclusion. Some of us don't. Let's solve those problems. But no, a billion people haven't been 100% left out. Nope.
No, and that's where context is also, important. Situational context,
yes.
You know, geographical, class, gender, you know, all of those things play a role into how greatly or otherwise you are included or excluded. You know,
right.
Those levels of privilege, also, you know, the situation that you find yourself in, you know, whether or not you're tired and stressed and there's other stuff going on in your life can impact, especially with cognitive disabilities, how well you're able to include yourself, right? Because sometimes when you're firing on all cylinders, you can work your way around these things and they don't become barriers, or you know, they're barriers that are not, you know, too high, so you can step over them and you know, join the party. And then other times when you're under stress, you're tired, you know, the brain fog kicks in. Right. Those barriers become insurmountable. You find yourself excluded. And I think that, you know, with an aging society, we're building lots and lots of systems where there is that peril again.
Yeah.
There will be loads of people that don't consider themselves to be disabled, you know, maybe don't even qualify under the definition of disability precisely, but that find themselves partially included, partially excluded, you know,
right.
and that still has a cost. It's then defining it, right? So how do we, you know, get the buy-in that you have this intangible thing, because people like stuff that's measurable, they like hard numbers. How do you then define what that is, what good looks like, and come up with a plan for getting some of the way there with the funds available? And you know,
I think, you know, I think that's a wonderful question. Sorry to step on you, and I think that's a great question. And I've been very open about how we've struggled with the work that I'm doing, my Billion Strong team and stuff for global impact, how we've struggled with funding, because there is a lot of funding that's being spent on including people with disabilities, funding trillions of dollars all over the world. But I think sometimes the community doesn't see the benefit from those efforts. I know, just speaking as a mother of a daughter with Down syndrome at 36 that has some health problems, and everything my family walked, and I know more than most people, and it has been so difficult. It has been so difficult. And I think, and yet we must have it so much easier than everybody else. And so the reality is, I think we at least have to start talking about what the real problems are so that we can then say, all right, how do we deal with this? But I also think, as I've been looking around and trying to figure out, how do we really do a better job with this? How do we get this funded and things like that? There are actually groups that are really, really focusing on this now. We're seeing impact investments happening. We're starting to see some things. I'm going to have some really exciting announcements coming out in the next couple of months, and where we're seeing money that really does want to be used for good, and that money is saying, well, all right, y'all been saying we aren't doing it right. How actually should we do it? But I believe the way to do that is we got to join the conversations and make sure more voices are heard, so that it's just not Debra Rue speaking for everybody else, or it's just not whatever. It's got to be more of us coming together. And so I think, honestly, and I hate to be optimistic, but I think we're starting to head in the right direction. At least we're having these kind of conversations, where it's like, okay, let's just put it out there. It's not complete exclusion, but the exclusion that we do have is not good for you either, Brand. It's not good for you either. It's not good for society, and it's certainly not good for the individuals that it's impacting and all of the family members and friends around them that are being impacted.
Well, I'm also hopeful that there is a movement towards more effective investment in stuff to move the needle forwards, rather than just investing in making noise. I think we need to, put investments into looking at structural issues and those kind of things, and how stuff connects, because it is, as we've been talking about for over a decade now, extremely siloed, and despite all of the money that does get allocated, there is this, scarcity mentality, which causes people to continue to silo, circle the wagons, and fight for their slice of the pie. And I'm still going back, to the conversations we had with Kurt Yeager just before Christmas, which I thought was really interesting, because his approach was about growing. It was about growing money and using the money to continue to push the aims. So it's that positive investment, and it's rather than it always being about money coming back out and asking for more money. It's about becoming self-sustaining, to be able to maintain the momentum, because we've seen a lot of cutbacks in central government funding around the world. Right. They're not investing, right? So then people go shaking the tin, and it's difficult, because everybody believes that they have a good cause. They probably do. And everybody believes that they deserve the money, which they probably do. But there's only so much money to go around, and people get charity fatigue.
Oh gosh, I agree.
It's like
and fund.
Please don't put on another telethon. Please don't come and ask me again.
Crowdsourcing. Oh yay!
But I think we have also a small problem in the other end, is that in many systems around the world, people are penalized if they work. They lose their benefits if they decide to go into an entrepreneurial journey. I'm not saying that they're going to succeed. Even testing. Okay, let's see if I'm going to be able to. I'm going to try to create a business. I'm going to try to see if this works. Just the process of trying is going to penalize the person.
Yeah. So you can't. You're precluded from being able to be. Play a full or even a partial role in the labor force, because of the way that the system's set up. And by the way, I don't want my previous comments to make people think that I don't ever want to give or participate in the charitable process. But people are,
You're just
some of these
fatigued
things
by
should
it.
be done systemically. And what's happened is we've relied on individuals all of the time, and we're relying on philanthropy. Why is it that we pay taxes and all the rest of it, but we're asking individuals to support, feed people, right? To provide wheelchairs for people, to buy basic medicines to keep people alive. I'm thinking of I always feel conflicted because for example, there are advocates out in our community that are dependent on the goodwill of the community to stay alive.
Yeah,
Right?
which
To be able to
there's
buy
something wrong
life-saving
with that
medication.
too, right?
Yeah.
Because
But at
the
the same
work
time, it's like,
matters.
well, I can't do it for everyone. This needs to have a much more joined up systemic approach to it.
I agree.
And that becomes even more strange when that need comes from people living in some of the most wealthiest country on the planet. When people living in countries who have a different healthcare structure, that's not the case. So people get confused. Oh no, why do you need that type of support in that country, considering all the wealth and all the power that the country seems to have?
Yeah. So I mean, it's the inequity is astounding, and I think that that drives exclusion. These are the social determinants of health that we often see. But some of those are driven by social policy as well. So even in the UK, which still does have the remnants of a national health service, it's definitely a 2 or 3 tier system, and that impacts on people's ability to access services, to be able to participate in society. So if you can pay, you can get a diagnosis for ADHD or another neurodivergent condition, and you can get support. But if you can't, you wait 4 years. Maybe that's the 4 years that are crucial to your education, that mean that you will never be getting the qualifications that you need to be able to get the jobs that would enable you to succeed in life had you had the support that at the beginning. And that's the difference that maybe £400 would make. Right, £400 is not a lot for the state, but it's a lot for many families that are thinking about heating and eating and lighting and all the rest of it. So and it has that massive, long knock-on effect.
But those €400 might not be much for the state now, but probably 20 years from now, those €40 that government is not willing to spend will be, it will triple in terms of the support that they might need to provide to that person.
Yeah.
Oh, it's more than that, because what happens is when people don't get diagnosed, they end up in the penal system, and the cost of keeping people in prison is enormous. So what happens is, by saving a small amount of money right now, we're pushing the cost and magnifying it further down the line. But I think that this is not a unique problem to one country. It's endemic in politics, and one of the challenges in any country is, if you have an electoral cycle, stuff is driven by elections. Even in China, where they have a one-party state, things are still driven by the internal calendar of the Chinese Communist Party. So the people that make decisions that drive society are always looking to these points, which pushes away from long-termism and the investment in some of these things. I think that the Scandinavian models have generally been quite good and more long-term, and the happiness and the gap between rich and poor is also significantly less. I think people feel more included.
I also think that we have to realize that we're not solving the right problems anymore. So, when you look at the way, just using that example you were using with the UK government, it is so cumbersome. There's no way that they can ever make that work. There are other ways we could actually do it so that people don't even have to ask for the extra support. The support is blended in a way that we're looking at the individuals. So I'm just saying, we are trying to solve these old problems in the same way in a broken systems. And so what we actually do is really need to do what we're doing. We need to be rethinking and asking, are we solving the right problem? Wait a minute, by the way, the problem is not that 1 billion people have been 100% left out. The problem is they're partially excluded. We should solve the problems based on the data. So that's what I'm also hoping for. Now that we have the AI, good, bad, whatever, could we use the AI to even help solve the problems in different ways to allow humans to work on this to solve the real problem? Anyway, this is a good time to be exploring what are the real problems, and now how do we take everything we're doing and start applying it to those problems instead of trying to solve something that isn't what's wrong.
So sometimes I have some conflicting issues when people start talking about the need for data. Just because if we just follow our journey as humans from when we're born to when we're old, I think it's very, this is happening for thousands of years in the exact same way. We know what is happening while people age. So we know that consequences of life, we are not machines. So I would do understand that if we were machines, we might need data to identify the faults of the machines that they might have. But we are not machines. So sometimes I get conflicted, a bit of internal conflict when we start talking about we need data. When sometimes we only need to look around society to look to the data that already exists, like demographics, that we tend to ignore, for many years, that we know in Europe, in many countries, that societies are aging. We know that right. since the 70s, and progress. And sometimes I see some posts or conversations today, almost like if nobody was aware that was coming, when we talk about that, the healthcare services are overcrowded, too many older people get sick with the flu. So it's a bit of conflict.
Yeah. I agree. And I know we got to close, but I just want to make one real quick comment and just say that I agree with you about the data, but at the same time, when we're using wrong data and stuff, that's also really making things worse. So actually, if we're going to go after the data, let's actually get the accurate data. And I know you agree with. And I know we need to close, Neil, back to you.
Yeah, so I need to thank our friends, MyClearText and Amazon, for keeping us on air, keeping us captioned, and we look forward to continuing this conversation on social media.